Hello, everyone. I'm not sure if we have a full house yet. We'll give it a minute or so and then we'll kick it off. Thanks for attending. All right. I see we have a live audience. Thanks again so much, everyone, for attending. We have all parts of the world covered from the LRQA perspective today. We have myself, who's dialing in from Hong Kong. We have our principal for responsible sourcing, Meghan Quinlan, who is dialing in from the US. And we have our head of channel partnerships for LRQA, Erin Lyon, who's dialing in from the UK. We each look at the issues of WROs from a different perspective. I look after EiQ, which is our technology platform, whereas Meghan and Erin have deep consulting experience helping companies in issues or instances when WROs surface. But before we get in, why are we having this discussion? And what is a WRO? I appreciate for some folks, you may have heard this tossed about by your compliance teams or your legal teams, especially recently, frantically. Well, we're here to help with that. To begin with, WRO or withhold release orders, it's actually a relatively old trade mechanism. It dates back to the 1930s in the U.S. and it's a prohibition of imported goods mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part by convict labor, forced labor, or indentured labor under penal sanctions. So when we talk about WROs, there is implicit nexus with forced labor, which is the context in which we are looking at it today. The mechanism itself was little used actually for most of its history until about 2015. We'll talk a little bit more about what changed then and what's been the case today. But the reason why we're doing this now is it's increasingly common. There's over 50 WROs in place today. There's been three of note within 2025 that have come up, one in seafood, one with sea salt, and most recently one involving Taiwan and bicycles, which is part of the reason for us kicking it off. The reason why it's a popular mechanism is because it's relatively flexible and risk-based in looking at how you would target a sector, product, or region. It also, follows a similar logic to what we think a great risk-based program design looks like. We can talk about that later. Outside of that as well, it's really quite sweeping because it forces the burden of proof away from the government to actually the individual importer to prove that you are innocent. Beyond that, though, and I think specific to the context today that we're looking at, some of you might be wondering what has led to this issue of a WRO out of Taiwan with giant bicycles. And I would say that in many ways, as you'll hear more later from our fellow panelists, the circumstances around a WRO can sometimes be quite ambiguous, how you would potentially be targeted, or there's many things that could cause risk, but what would lead to like this specific instance might be less certain. But if we look at the Taiwan context, we think there's actually a few issues at play here that are especially important for framing the discussion. First, migrant worker dynamics. We'll continue to that slide in just a minute, team. Migrant worker dynamics, long a problem, have become particularly exacerbated by the U.S.-China trade war and decoupling from China. Second, and this is actually an additional reason why this is important, because more so than ever, forced labor is under scrutiny. WROs as a mechanism have existed for quite a long time, but right now we are seeing a broadening of bans outside of just the US context, where we have in the UK, the EU, forced labor bans being considered, and also similar bans being considered in Australia and New Zealand as well. So there is a global precedent that's forming. But also, I think specific to why this has happened within the United States, there is a political context as well. There has long been a suspicion that underlying the cost of production in foreign markets have been externalities within labor. And that is partly why I think now more so than ever, markets like Taiwan are being scrutinized. It is part of this broader movement to decouple or reconfigure supply chains. So what we're doing today and why we're looking at this and what we hope you take away from it are really a few things. First, an understanding that there are warning signs, and oftentimes the warning signs are ignored. They've been ignored in this case. The information is there if you're looking at the right data. It's really important that you consider the full cost perspective of how WROs might shape your organization. It's much more than just not having your goods being allowed into port. Will help you hopefully identify some hotspots to avoid being headlined as part of what is likely further forthcoming WROs, and also consider the question of where there might be gaps within your program. With that, to our first topic. So there we go. Taiwan. There have been warning signs around Taiwan for a number of years prior to this WRO being issued. Actually, if we look at the risk data that we've seen in 2025 in EiQ, we have known that the most extreme source of risk for Taiwan is forced labor-related risk. There's other types of risk present there. Taiwan is a bit better in some regards than other sourcing markets in East Asia. Health and safety is a problem, but so too is migrant workers, which really led to the dynamic that we're looking at today. The migrant worker dynamic is long-standing, as concerns around forced labor. They date back to 2021. And we have seen, based upon the audits that we undertake, consistent problems around the working hours of Taiwanese firms and also wages paid to workers. All of these create kind of a perfect storm or the context for us potentially looking at a problem or looking at this issue surfacing. With that, with the information being available, there's been a lot of action actually around this. For this, I'd invite my colleague Erin to comment.
Thanks, JP. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yes, JP, you talked about the warning signs, and I think, as you can see here, there is so much information, useful information available to help and enable us to understand the market, the trade flows, ownership structures, and we'll come back to that later in terms of how on earth do you stay abreast of all these topics and all these updates and all these kind of reports that we're showing you here. But I think what we also want to reflect on as well is there's a lot of information. It's a known issue for decades, but also there's a lot of action as a result of some of this as well. So I really wanted to, I think it'd be remiss of us to focus on all the information without talking about the action. And because we've been working with clients for a number of years and we've been able to identify these risks, there have been a lot of activities on the ground to enable the management of these topics. And I'll just give a few examples of that so that we can show it can be done. So we've been working together with a lot of industries, especially those industries that have really been under scrutiny. So if you look at the apparel sector, if you look at cars, if you look at automotive, if you look at electronics, and obviously if you look at bicycles, what we've seen within those industries is a lot of focus on working with entire groups of suppliers on building responsible recruitment toolkits to enable and to build capacity. And then as part of that, to be able to deliver big fee remediation projects where you're returning any fees that have been paid to existing and former workers within a really agreed and formalized structure that can be reported on. There's also a lot of capacity building requirements, a lot of on-site and also remote training that's been done as well. And then what we've been doing is a lot of forced labor investigations, and that's a really structured way of looking at enabling the ability to investigate these issues. So utilizing this information that JP has talked about to do a much deeper dive, to build a correction plan and focus on a prevention plan as well. So that the information is there and the action is happening. So what I'm going to do, if we flip to the next slide, thank you, Chandler, we're going to focus. Meghan's just going to give us a little bit of insight in terms of how this isn't a one-off.
Sure. I mean, I think most of us have been a little bit familiar with withhold release orders over the last 5 years. So there's been around between 50, 55 since 2020. And as JP said at the beginning, you know, across the continents, across different sectors, right? And so where Erin, you know, is speaking to what are the types of forced labor investigations you can do, you know, over the last 5 years, we've just seen an increase in, you know, this very specific type of preparation and investigation, right, in relationship to these WROs. So, you know, one of the things with, you know, that the government, once these have been released, it's of course guilty until proven innocent. In broad strokes, what has been challenging in the past in particular is that there wasn't significant guidance. However, really what we've learned to understand through our work with companies in, you know, responding to WROs as well as helping create playbooks is that it really focuses on understanding where your risks and your salient risks are, particularly where you're an importer of record, monitoring and due diligence that is stratified according to that risk is critical. And that monitoring has to be varied as well. So scheme audits generally have not been as well accepted in the past. Grievance mechanisms have to be included or are generally best included, as well as supplier engagement and the remediation that follows. So it's the typical things you would see in an HRDD type of legislation or human rights due diligence programming. Very helpfully in July, the CBP did release a guidance document on WROs, right? So I would encourage anybody who's looking at how putting together a crisis playbook to take a look at that. It's incredibly helpful to have a level of guidance now. Of course, if you speak to any law firms, I'm sure they will tell you this is not law, this is not regulation. However, the guidance is certainly useful, and companies are starting now to also get a little bit more information when they receive the withhold release orders. For example, you know, within the ILO forced labor indicators, which is the indicator that's really been that have been flagged within your supply chain, right? So continuing to evolve, but you know, we do expect this to be a continued tool of the administration as we continue forward. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, JP.
Coming back to me, this one, I think just in terms of one other thing I would say, Meghan, as well, is what we know is CBP is staffing up as well, right? We know there's more of this coming. The intention is to focus on these activities a lot more, and that over time what we've seen is increased usage and much deeper dives from the CBP as an organization into really understanding the entire supply chains and the expectations of remediation as well. So there's a lot that's been learned over the past few years. But for the next couple of slides, what we thought we would do is try and answer the question that we always get, which is, how much is this going to cost me? Because if you're faced with one of these, that's the immediate, well, how am I going to fix this? How do I make it go away? Both from the individual manufacturer who's named on the WRO, but also then the buyers of. So this we're just looking at from, and this slide from a brand perspective. And the way that I always think about it is like a stone being thrown into a lake. And when that stone lands, you get the immediate initial splash, and that's the sort of the initial costs. They're what I would call the stop costs. They're how is this going to have an immediate and maybe even longer term impact in terms of I don't have access to the things that I'm looking to sell. But then there's the ripple that just, and this is the harder bit in many respects, because the ripple just keeps going. And that's all of the time and all of the additional requirements that are needed because of all the knock-on impacts. And they just continue, that we've observed years after the WR as well, which is why we're stuck in a reactive environment where we have an issue and we react to it. And what we're looking at here is how do we get ahead of these so that we're not looking down the barrel of, if I'm a buyer, these are the costs that I'm potentially having to look to mitigate as a result of the WRO. And if you go to the next slide as well, Chandler, that obviously we were looking at that very much from a brand perspective, but at the same side, you've also got the named manufacturer who often, what we've found, has less capacity, less experience to manage a lot of these topics. They sometimes are listed companies, sometimes non-listed companies, and won't necessarily have that crisis playbook to manage. So there's always that additional thinking that I think is required from the buyer side in terms of what am I going to do? What is my playbook as it relates to when one of my manufacturers, if they get hit by a WRO, what do I need to do in this instance? How can we look to engage? What should we be doing on instant and then thereafter? But more importantly, what can we do from a prevention perspective? Because inevitably, this is going to have a huge impact on us on that ripple effect go forward basis, both directly related to this WRO, but also because once you're in the spotlight for these topics, it's incredibly difficult to get out of that. And when you're in the spotlight for one topic, that continues to grow and grow and grow. And that's where it gets hard to get ahead. So JP, back to you.
All right. Let's maybe switch to the next slide, Chandler. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit around Taiwan, and we can see the problem that it's created there. Clearly, WROs are very costly. When you have a WRO, it's very hard to get off the list. It is a multi-year process that will reconfigure your supply chains and hit both your top and bottom line. So what's the solution? Get ahead of it. And how do you get ahead of it? And I know that this might seem overwhelming for those of you that have undertaken, a human rights impact assessment, but that is a pretty good base actually for framing out where you should prioritize. But our caveat with that is you got to be using the right data. So EiQ, our supply chain due diligence technology, every year we consolidate data over 25, 30,000 social audits. This includes specific scrutiny over the type of audit standard that is used. We care a lot around data quality. And one of the things that we have found, if we go to the next slide, is that the risk around forced labor is everywhere, and it doesn't necessarily follow the easy breakdown that we often have of risk and sourcing. Asia high risk, West low risk. Actually, it's present in different ways in different markets. So within the past 2 years, we have found forced labor within over 40 countries. This includes Western jurisdictions, including the United States, including Australia, including the United Kingdom, including Germany. And how that plays out is, as mentioned, in some ways substantially different because labor markets work differently within these regions than in, say, China, Taiwan, or parts of Southeast Asia. But there's a few important commonalities with this. So first, there's often this element of debt servitude that comes in. The mechanism of that can be different. It can be, through excessive recruitment fees. It can also, and we're especially seeing this within East Asia, come in the forms of add-on penalties for health checkups. That again, because of the financial impact of them, the size of them, put labor in this position of debt servitude. The mechanism can vary, but the core with that is it restricts worker freedoms and it violates some of the ILO indicators of forced labor. With that, Meghan, if we're looking beyond just like debt bondage, what other forced labor indicators should we be paying attention to, especially now for what the CBP are targeting?
Sure. I mean, it's a mix, and a little bit of it depends also on which country you're operating in, right? Because forced labor shows up differently depending on that context. So, for example, the Dominican Republic is a little bit similar to the U.S. in that the key challenge there is, the workforce that is being relied upon is not legal, right? Because there's not a legal pathway for most of the workforce. And so there the challenge is not or in a country similar to the DR, right, or in the US, even though we're not talking about the US, it's not going to be withholding of documentation, right? Because that's not the issue. So it just highlighting that does show up differently in different contexts. I'd say, and Erin, I'd love you to weigh in on this as well, but the withholding of wages is pretty common. I think excessive overtime usually goes along with things, as does things like abusive living conditions or the abuse of vulnerability. The challenge, of course, with the ILO indicators is these are based on kind of common signs or clues on the possible existence of forced labor, right? They're based on the practical experience of the ILO's special program to combat forced labor. But it's a fine line also, right, between where forced labor starts or where kind of just exploitation or poor work condition ends and forced labor starts, right? So I think that's always a fine line that we're trying to understand. And so that's why it's, again, through how systemic is it, how many of these indicators are included in these types of investigations or WROs, and what is the workers' sense of freedom, which is why kind of the worker surveys, the grievance mechanisms, the worker voice is a critical component to really understanding some of the nuance. But Erin, I'm sure you have a lot of insight as well.
Meghan, I think you nailed it on that one. I think it's what we have with these 11 indicators is a framework, and that's the critical piece, is being able to utilize this to engage, to do the training, to be able to share. And there is a lot of training guidance materials under each of these, being able to break that down and say, well, what does this mean in reality? What does this look like? Give me some case studies, share the details so it becomes broader knowledge. Where you run into challenges as well is you might have a situation where you have compliance with local laws, but a breach of one of these requirements as well. And that's where they run into challenges in Taiwan, for example, and where there's further work that needs to be undertaken.
Cool. I think we're going to look, maybe at a few examples now of what this looks like in practice. So I think what we have here, and Meghan, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but the CBP has specifically identified the way that recruitment fees can play out in a problematic way, creating debt bonded situations in a few different markets. And there's really two buckets of themes. So you have upfront fees. So these are fees paid to home country recruiters for placement. If you are evaluating the fees that your workers have paid, the general kind of benchmark that would be used to categorize or characterize these as excessive are summarized for Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines herein. This is how the CBP looks at it. But there is also a second type of fee structure, and that is your ongoing fees, which, like in the case with Taiwan, are the fees paid to the Taiwanese brokers after immigrants arrive in Taiwan. And again, the size of the fee and what is deemed to be excessive, it varies depending upon the nature of it. With monthly service fees, your alien resident certificate fee and your medical testing fees, because medical testing, again, is one area where we see this playing out in Taiwan. It's summarized herein, but again, oftentimes that line is quite gray. Meghan, do you have anything to add here?
No, I just say, I just think in a broader context as well, there's obviously been a lot of work done on recruitment fees and repayment of worker fees. I think some of the challenges that a lot of companies, the leaders in particular, have worked through is like, when do we start? From how far back do we enforce it? When was our communication? So getting all that kind of stuff set up. Some of the questions we get, I think, from more cynical clients, which is fair enough, is, don't workers just know that if they tell them we paid these fees, then they'll get reimbursed? And, isn't it just kind of like a free for all at this point? I'd say from our experience, there's one country where you could say that would be, potentially the case, right, for sure. But outside of that, there's absolutely no sign of that happening, right? That's across, it just hasn't been infiltrated with as much focus for as long. There's a lot of great guidance documents and tools of, if you need to estimate, what your repayment would look like. Obviously, repaying the fees is difficult as well, right? It's a whole network of absconded workers and a whole specialization in and of itself. But yeah, I think in terms of Taiwan, this covers it. And, again, concepts of knowing there's multiple levels of fees. The complexity is hard to just get to a simple point, but eventually you can get there, and there's a lot of frameworks out there to help you do that.
And maybe one broader question for myself on this, certainly folks look into the issue of repaying recruitment fees when this surfaces from a WRO. Oftentimes that is a critical part of making the case for having the WRO lifted. But say that you are not in that position and you are just beginning to find out, through your grievance mechanisms or other tools that actually recruitment fees are pretty prevalent within your supply chain. How do you kind of make the case internally without having the big stick of like the WRO hanging over your head that actually this is urgent, this is important, and could become a business critical issue?
Maybe I'll take that one, JP, which is where that cost slide came from that we put together, right? In terms of what are the potential costs if it is me, and also that ripple effect. This is where we see, because if you're in one of those if you're in one of the industries in the spotlight or near adjacent or sourcing from that country, what you will see over a period of time is that you will be receiving a lot of questions in terms of, oh, well, we see this as an issue in this market. What are you doing? Give me evidence to me that this isn't an issue for you. Where if I'm an investor, for example, show me that nothing is at risk here in terms of you being impacted in the same way. So there are lots of different ways in which we see that ripple expanding. It could be you're in a an industry association and the norms start developing and evolving, and you can't be left behind, so to speak. There are lots of different touch points for the carrots and the sticks, and hopefully through these slides we've provided a few of those, because you've got regulation upcoming as well. In the EU, what we've seen in the US is coming to play in December 27. So you've got a year, and at the moment you're thinking, okay, so I can't get my goods into the US. In a year's time, you'll be thinking, oh, hold on, that means it's not going to the US or Europe. And what we see on top of that is the political realities of this new administration building these requirements into their trade agreements as well. If you look at the Indonesian-US trade agreement from earlier this year, there is a specific paragraph where it says, you know, the Indonesian government will comply with forced labor regulations, etc., etc. So we know that this is part of the new playbook.
Yeah, fascinating. And it is funny too, because if we look at like the case with Giant as an example, it might seem a little bit out of the blue that like you have a bicycle manufacturer without there really being a big precedent of this within policy of them being targeted. But if you zoom out a little bit and look at the broader trade context and also the dynamics surrounding both migrant workers and you know, general forced labor enforcement, there actually is a pretty clear precedent for this being an issue for those types of consumer product brands. Let's maybe go to the next slide. So we've talked a little bit around recruitment fees. How do those recruitment fees play out? So a key part of global supply chains are the use of labor agencies. And this does add a layer of complexity and risk in, because oftentimes these are the mechanism by which recruitment fees are levered, and they also can often place loose controls over workers. Certain markets are more exposed to labor agents than others. So if we look at those that have used labor agents, key regions of concern. So Malaysia, number one. Taiwan, not far behind. So, you know, we have found, 75% of the time suppliers that we have looked at in Taiwan have actually used labor agents. Again, signaling that perhaps actually there were indicators well in advance that there was a risky dynamic in place with how folks were brought to market. This continues to be true throughout a lot of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and South America. And I don't think, again, there's nothing inherently problematic about labor agents. Actually, it's critical to continue with production. But I think the thing that you probably want to be really concerned about is that there is proper due diligence in place in looking at the practice of the labor agents that are bringing in workers into your supply chain. And so, Meghan, I guess maybe with this, you work a lot in understanding, for example, at the extent to which worker surveys can be a mechanism for checking this, or looking at other types of assessment tools on this. If you find, for example, that labor agents have a disproportionate material role in actually your supply chains, what types of checks and balances should you be thinking about from an assessment standpoint?
Yeah, so I mean, there's, typically historically our rule was like, if there's more than 10% of the workforce comes from a labor agent, then you're going to want to make sure in advance that you have, a really robust section on forced labor. What we see within checklists in general, like everybody, they cover the same thing, right? I think we're all aware that we're all covering child labor, forced labor, wages, working hours, right? Some they blend, 3 points together, and others separate them out, right? And so if you're looking at a site though that has a significant workforce within labor agents, that's when we typically work with clients to ensure that they have a detailed enough portion of that forced labor area, right, to really be capturing those. Also, that you have enough time to be capturing those. Also, if you're kind of, these really sensitive issues are really difficult to uncover, right, for a whole host of reasons. And so, if you rewind the clock in auditing 20 years ago, auditors generally had a lot of flexibility to say, oh, I think there might be child labor, forced labor here. I'm going to follow this thread. And then, I don't have to fill out the rest of the checklist, or I won't focus as much on that. That flexibility isn't there as much anymore, which makes a lot of sense, right? People are reporting out on their reporting. They have to have equanimity and say, we checked all of these things across all of our suppliers. In order to upload a report to SEDEX, you have to fill out the 300 points, right? So there's all good reasons for it. But if you are conducting an assessment where you are time constrained, then you also should be aware that, maybe you should add some time on to make sure that you're covering that in depth, right? Because you also need to have translators on site or make sure you have all the appropriate language assistance that you need. This is also generally when we would recommend having a worker survey as well, just because sensitive issues, whether it's harassment or forced labor, are 7 to 9 times more likely to be uncovered in an anonymous worker survey versus kind of a face-to-face interview, right? So there's different tools, but overall it's tricky, and it depends on your program.
Great. Thanks, Meghan. One third and final area that we want to look at is excessive overtime. This is, again, one of the ILO indicators. And, what we see is actually in factories where you have really, really good data because you're using a tough standard like IRSA, you're able to accurately measure it. Even within many of the world's largest retailers, you're seeing a huge prevalence of overtime. So, sometimes this will look like having 10% of your factories where there's over 30 days of workers being worked continuously on average. No Sundays, no breaks. Where oftentimes that same 10% will also have some workers that have been worked over 100 days continuously, where over 50% of factories may have 20% or their average time in factory be at 20 days or more, or 50 days in terms of the extreme outliers. I mean, all of this, if I were looking at this factory data, in my mind, this would be a pretty high risk group for potentially having a WRO issued against it. Now, obviously, overtime is a complicated issue, especially in markets where there's migrant workers that are there. Oftentimes, migrant workers will make an argument for staying beyond, for the season that they're there so that they're able to get the most out of it. But, even with that being said, there is a fairly clear, bright line over what is excessive. And like the data that we're seeing here, I don't think we need to explain why having someone in the factory for 400 days continuously without a break is actually deeply problematic. So if that's you got to think about how to make a case to your management about doing something different, lest you be subject to WRO. With that, maybe let's look beyond just Taiwan as a market. We see this surfacing in many other regions. Meghan, do you have comment on some other regions that you think are potentially at risk of having WROs levied against them? Maybe regions that we wouldn't normally think about.
I'm not going to put myself on the glass ball right now, JP, but thank you for thinking I can tell the future. But I think, overall, and there's such a broad group of people on this call as well, right? When we're looking at, our sectors and our countries, I think we all have a pretty good sense of where the risk is, right? So for Taiwan, as an example, we've been working on forced labor in Taiwan since well, since I joined LRQA, which was 11 years ago, right? And so since then is when it was one of our special sideline countries of, this is a high risk for forced labor, and therefore it has kind of these special, during the coordination process, we're going to do these things, right? When you look at, all you need to do is look at kind of media. Brazil is always there, right? Like sugar, coffee, we see it for all of these sectors. I think, one of the lead-ins that, when CBP was first standing up the UFLPA programming, one of the kind of ways they were trying to figure out, okay, was where do we focus, is they had a bunch of staff kind of just like scouring the internet, being like, okay, where's the risk, right? And, then became reliant on NGOs and academics to help them understand where the risk is. Now they have, unless this has changed, which is possible, but, as of, a year or so ago, they would have kind of quarterly meetings with NGOs and academics to say, where's our risk, right? And so, all of the things that you see in the media, right, also is a good indication of what you might then see again in within a WRO. If you think of, India and shrimp, if you think of all these types of things that we see day in and day out, I think are relatively fair game. So not a maybe very satisfying answer, JP, but I think if we go back and look at our country and sector analyses and what kind of production are there, right, that's where you're going to see the risk. Erin, I see you took yourself off mute, so please jump in with your glass ball.
I wish. I'd know the football scores in advance if that was the case. No, in terms of JP, I want to take this one back to your previous question about, how do you engage management? Because I'm sure most of the people on this call are already thinking about these kind of risks, but when you can present this data that changes the view of a board of senior professionals who aren't day-to-day in this detail to challenge the assumptions around where is risk. And that's why the data-informed approach is so critical. And whenever you've been in a room and you've been able to present that data-informed view of risk, that's when you can have a new type of conversation. So I would throw that into your toolbox of things to discuss with management, JP, to your previous question.
Yeah, definitely. Let's maybe spend a little bit of time looking at what supply chain confidence looks like. So Chandler, if you can flick through, yes, exactly. How do we think at least about building the right framework, given that sources of risk are many? How the targeting mechanism might play out actually can be a bit random. Extreme penalties for getting it wrong. Well, we think that there's a few things that are necessary. The first is you have to have a reliable form for evaluating your risks. You have to have a risk assessment process that's not built around crap data, not the publicly disclosed stuff, but actually rooted in real risk data that is present within the supply chain. By the way, this is also like the way that most due diligence laws are evolving. There is greater scrutiny over the loose practices that were used previously to make generalizations about, Asia high risk, West low risk. That stuff doesn't hold muster anymore, nor does a static risk assessment. The idea that you could still use the segmentation that you had in place from 2022 or 2023. These risks move more quickly than that, and what might be material then is perhaps no longer as material compared to other risks. So first, the risk assessment process and the evaluation. Beyond that, though, you also need to have, as a part of that, multi-source triangulation, where you're looking at different forms of historical audit data, where you're looking at adverse media data or alternate data that could also inform, what the CBP is looking at when they're making their case for, you potentially being guilty of this. Worker grievance data is something that Meghan mentioned that also I think is increasingly factoring in. But beyond that, you then have to afterwards look at, putting it together for a case of where probably, again, using a risk-based perspective, you're most likely to be exposed to something like this happening. With that, let's maybe go to the next slide, Chandler. Next slide, Chandler. There we go. So that involves first zooming out and then zooming in. Site scorecards, I think, are the kind of minimum for actually being sure that you have adequate controls in place. But on top of that, I would also add, at a time where we are increasingly seeing decoupling from traditional production markets, how are your new sites, the ones that procurement teams are just beginning to pilot now, on which you have no audit data in place, actually being subject to a due diligence process that would make sure that you are managing risk appropriately? And here is where the alternate data comes in, but also a framework for risk management that extends beyond a single audit standard and perhaps doesn't try and reinvent the wheel, but use existing records that are on place. Again, if you're interested in more about that, we can talk about that separately as a part of EiQ. In addition to that, I think outside of just understanding where to prioritize, there's a flip side that I think Meghan, maybe you're really probably in the best position to cover this. What are the traits of low risk suppliers? Who do you need to not worry about?
So I think, this is almost like the double click to, you have your risk exposure and then you have your risk management, right? But then when you get those caps, when you get those audit reports, when you get those worker surveys, what should you be looking at? The other thing before I get into this, I'd say companies are layering in a lot more data at this point too, right? So I think 5 years ago, companies really were just using kind of some of those inputs that we said, for risk management, right? The caps, the worker surveys, the SAQs. We're seeing more of that. We're also seeing a layering in of data, whether if in the food sector, maybe it's food safety data, kind of concept of, if a supplier is not effective at managing their food safety management systems, they might not have there for their labor force either, right? In the tech world, not surprising, early adopters of tech and data-driven insights have layered in, a lot of different data to understand where their supplier risk is. So I think we'd be negligent to not talk to mention that and how quickly that is changing. But in terms of when you're looking at your suppliers, a lot of it is, the management systems that are in place, right? So the proven capability to have similar results across their different sites, right? That they are proactive about the risk and understand what you're looking for. And then a lot of it goes to as well about what is the management mindset, right? When you're thinking about, are they collaborating with you? Are they showing forward motion on the corrective actions? If they're not, are they being transparent about why not? Are you having honest conversations about it? So I think these are the types of things that, and some clients quantify them. Others, I'd say in general, not necessarily there yet. This is where I think companies are saying, yeah, we always know the problem suppliers and the good suppliers, right? But there's not always necessarily a strong rubric to determine that. But I'd say this is what kind of falls into it, right? And then, of course, there are different scorecards and such that clients work with that, not to underplay that by any means, but I think these are some of the softer touch with some of the key kind of, not KPIs, but, a management system or progress on continuous action certainly is.
Definitely. And I'd just add, maybe one of the things that's like quite important to highlight, because I think these concepts exist within the West for how folks look at risk, but it's probably not really understood what this looks like in the context of a production market, like for a Chinese or Taiwanese factory. But you got to make sure that within your risk assessment process, that your adverse media covers things like social media incidents outside of just things that you would normally think about, like government sanctions or restricted countries. More and more public media incidences are informing the cases that are brought against companies. It's pretty easy now for workers or those that sit upstream within a supply chain to have a mechanism for voicing out problems that occur within operations. It's also pretty easy for that to get picked up by NGOs or others, local news sources, and potentially have it brought in. I think actually more than anything else, we should view this as a really good thing, because Chandler, if we go to the next slide, what we see is that actually, or don't see in this case, that there are certain types of risks, like those risks around, say, humane treatment or injuries to workers, where traditional audit programs actually those are hard issues to capture. Like, unless that happens on site while you're there, it's tough to have it picked up. But again, having this additional data source that's layered in, we've found in a lot of our project work, even in markets, especially in markets like the US, in places like restaurants where you wouldn't normally think about, like, what's the due diligence process for that? Actually, you can have huge gaps even within very mature, responsible sourcing programs, because you're not looking at the right data to back actually an evaluation of it. But layering this in helps address that. Maybe let's look at also outside of this, grievance mechanisms. Yeah. Meghan, maybe do you want to, and Erin too, run us through what those add to a program?
I'll go first. Who's quietest the longest? That was the who's winning that one. So yeah, on the grievance data, I think grievance data, grievance. It's one of these words. It means a lot of different things to different people, right? So is it just a hotline? Everybody has a 1-800 hotline, but we're seeing it. There's been a lot of buzz around grievance mechanisms, especially in the last few years, right? And that's because they're being written into some of the HRDD expectations. It's because they're part of the kind of WRO response. It's because, as companies are thinking, like, audit is a moment in time. How do we, incorporate kind of 360 days a year that we're on site, 365 days a year that we're on site? So that's really kind of the back end of grievance, but grievance can take really different, it can be rolled out really differently, right? So best practice in grievance mechanisms is to have it aligned with the UNGPs, right? So the accessibility, the trust, the that type of thing. And what that translates to is, is it in a local language? Is it in kind of an app or kind of otherwise accessible type of technology that workers are going to use? Do they trust the people who they're calling? Is there a response when they put in a grievance mechanism? Is there actually a response? Do they have are they seeing results for their efforts? And so these are all the types of things that go into it. We've set up, over the last 10 years, kind of starting out of the Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety is where we've had our first kind of really major grievance mechanism to date that still receives about 3,000 calls a month across all kinds of issues, right? To be honest, we've gotten everything from kidnapping to domestic abuse to kind of everything in the factory, right? And our protocol is, we need to have a referral network to support regardless, right? Regardless of whether the issue's at the factory or not. And then we have the remediation. What's important, though, for brands and retailers is they're like, oh, God, I can't stand up a grievance mechanism. You get 3,000 calls a month. Do I have to deal with those 3,000 calls a month, right? Like, how many people do you expect me to hire? And so it's what are the protocols? So it's kind of self-manage and then kind of clear reporting up, escalation path up, et cetera, so that brands can keep on and, your kind of building the capacity of the suppliers at the same time, while giving support for some of the, particularly the more challenging issues. You can see from the map, we've expanded kind of the blueprint that we set up in Bangladesh to other locations. Obviously, there's other grievance providers, not just us out in the world, but I do think a key part is the accessibility, the trust, and the remediation being integrated. But Erin, over to you.
Maybe just a future focus piece. Imagine you've done all the hard work and this is really about prevention of recurrence. And that's where we see GMs being that critical piece, right? It's the ongoing, what means I'm not going to have constant worries and what's on my sleepless night list. So you need to focus on that prevention of recurrence. So I put that in there. But JP, I'm conscious of time. I know we've got to depart shortly.
We might, I'd say just maybe to move this along and bring it to close. There are a few other types of data that can be extremely helpful. Supplier training obviously can play an important preventative role, but more than anything else, it's about awareness early on with that. So, on behalf of LRQA, Erin, Meghan, and I thank you for your time. And we'd also like to offer all of you, as folks that are interested in understanding your exposure to risk, we have an at-risk entity list that we use to track those that we're concerned about for their nexus with forced labor. Reach out to me, schedule a call. I'd be happy to provide it to you for the past 3 months. And based upon that, that can help begin you building your case for management for not being on the next WRO that comes out. So with that, we'll close. Thanks a ton, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.